In this flat, commonplace monosyllable is contained the wisdom of the government, the abstract intelligence of the universal will in the fulfilling of itself. The government is itself nothing else but the self-established focus or the individuality of the universal will. The government which wills and executes its will from a single point at the same time wills and executes a specific order and action. On the one hand, it excludes all other individuals from its act, and on the other, it thereby constitutes itself a government that is a specific will, and so stands opposed to the universal will. Consequently, it is absolutely impossible for it to exhibit itself as anything else but a faction. What is called government is merely the victorious faction, and in the very fact of it being a faction lies the direct necessity of its overthrow, and its being government makes it, conversely, into a faction, and so guilty. When the universal will maintains that what the government has actually done is a crime committed against it, the government, for its part, has nothing specific and outwardly apparent by which the guilt of the will opposed to it could be demonstrated. For what stands opposed to it as the actual universal will is only an unreal, pure will intention. Being suspected, therefore, takes the place or has the significance and effect of being guilty. And the external reaction against this reality that lies in the simple inwardness of intention consists in the cold, matter-of-fact annihilation of this existent self, from which nothing else can be taken away but its mere being. Paragraph 591 is rather short, but there's a lot going on here that needs to be unpacked in terms of the historical situation and the transitions that we've made up to this point in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. So there's really a lot to be said here about what Hegel himself is saying in very, very quick, outlined, you might say, fill-in-the-blanks kind of terms. Let's do some of that filling in the blanks here. So let's think for a moment about what this section is fundamentally about. This is kind of a linchpin right in the middle of this short absolute freedom and terror section, which is essentially about the Enlightenment and its you might say, highest point and also lowest point in the French Revolution, which occurs before Hegel writes this. As a matter of fact, the terror also occurred, but the effects of the French Revolution are continuing at the time that Hegel is writing this in the Napoleonic Empire and in a sort of reworking of the entirety of Europe insofar as, the world spirit on horseback, as the proverbial expression for Napoleon, is able to reimpose a kind of order. Now, he's not going to come up at this point, but we should keep that in mind. Instead, think about the transformations that are happening within the French Revolution. And if you remind yourself about what you may have, read or heard or learned in history class, the French Revolution starts out as a revolution against the French monarchy, but also against the two other estates which are connected with it. And those estates are in the nobility, of which the king is at the highest level, but all these other nobles, all these aristocrats who enjoy privileges, who get to be involved in governance, who have their own demences from which they draw income. And then we have the entirety of the clergy, the church, in this case the Catholic Church, within France, who again, range from the poorest friars dealing with the people living in the slums and sharing a life with them, all the way up to very powerful cardinals and abbots and bishops enjoying an incredibly luxurious lifestyle, some of them completely estranged from church doctrine or governance. As we see, there was a lot of corruption going on at the time. The revolution goes against those, and you might say gradually attempts to rip those out of French society and replace them with essentially a bourgeois society, the society of the Third Estate. We might also include in this what we often call the Fourth Estate, the opinion formers of the journalists, the newspapers, the reviews of the time. Now, why would that turn into terror? Well, here's where we're going to get to the key question. When you have a revolution, when you change the power structure fundamentally, very often this requires violence. This requires somebody to exert power against somebody else. Those people are not happy about losing their status, losing their power, losing their wealth, losing whatever other distinctions we might talk about, even if it's one simply of rank. Impoverished aristocrats are sometimes the most dangerous people because they would like to at least think of themselves as special because they are aristocrats. Similarly, in our own time, when we talk about those who enjoy, sort of the lowest form of privilege, the privilege of belonging to a semi-privileged class where the people at the top certainly enjoy it and the people at the bottom get to say, well, at least I'm not those people below me. Rousseau, by the way, identified this entire dynamic and discussed it at great length in several of his own works, including, if you want to check it out, the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality Among Men, something that Hegel himself is reacting to in these discussions. And why so? Because Rousseau's thought, along with that of others like the encyclopedists, was very important in shaping the conceptions of those who are involved in the world historical events of the French Revolution. Coming back to that now, what happens during the French Revolution? We see that there are alternate conceptions of how the new society is supposed to be formed, be shaped, take place. Who counts as a good person and who counts as a bad person? Who is a friend or an ally or a good subject, and who is an enemy? We have the problem of what is called faction. And you notice Hegel refers to that here, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. And one faction will gain the upper hand and suppress another faction. This happens quite frequently in revolutions, and the French Revolution was, no exception to this. In fact, it even, you might say, set the tone for it. What ended up happening was the moderate, let's call them, faction lost power, and the radical faction ended up taking power and then putting people to death, sometimes exiling them, but oftentimes rounding people up and guillotining them. This started a sequence in which gradually even those who had initiated those policies themselves found that they became the victims of those very policies. Once you start down the hyper-radical path and start saying that revolutionary justice allows for these very exceptional policies, it becomes very difficult to pull the brake back and get the machine to no longer lurch down the road towards greater and greater tragedies of that sort. Hegel talks about that here in the first sentence. He says, in this flat, commonplace monosyllable is contained the wisdom, the Weisheit, of the government. What is the flat monosyllable he's talking about? Well, that's referred to in the previous paragraph. He is talking about death, in German, Tod. And this isn't just any sort of death. In the previous paragraph, he talks about this as being essentially a meaningless death, the sort of death that has been stripped of significance, a death that is simply an effacement or an erasure of those who are dying. He uses this metaphor of no more significance than cutting off a head of cabbage. You're not even treating a human being like a human being. You're treating them as if they are a mere impediment, as if they are an insect that you should squash, as if they are a blight on your crop. There's a dehumanization going on here. And this is very important to dwell on for two reasons. So the one reason is there are many deaths that could be quite significant. And if we think about the path that we've traversed in the dialectic up until this point, all the way from the first clash of those two self-consciousnesses in the fable that Hegel was telling about the battle to the death, through the master-slave dialectic, the rest of self-consciousness, Stoicism, skepticism, unhappy consciousness, the entire reason section with all of its speculative and practical comportments, and then the massive spirit section that we're still in the middle of. Think about what we've traversed, from the beginning of spirit and the struggle between the individual or the family and the city-state and sometimes the government, and then traveling into the culture section in which we have wealth, state power, the noble and base consciousness, all of these dialectics over and over and over again. And then finally, a struggle, once culture had shown some of the nihilism that was nascent within it. We have a struggle between faith and enlightenment, and faith wins. Enlightenment wins. Things would have been very different had faith won, wouldn't they? As a matter of fact, if faith had won, we wouldn't have an advance of the dialectic. Instead, things would go back to that point and wait for us to move on ahead. And we can say the same thing about each point in the dialectic. One society may go this way, another society goes this way, and it's where there's a possibility of something new, something novel being worked out in relation to what is the reality of the time, not just coming out of nowhere, but coming out of the previous conditions. That's where the dialectic advances. And so here, returning back to this particular paragraph and this particular dialectic, we have what's going on within revolutionary France. We have other revolutions that have taken place. The British had a revolution in which they actually wound up killing a king. Of course, they brought them back in later on, right? It's not quite the same thing. Americans also had a revolution by this time in which they threw off the British. Here we're also going to see something kind of interesting playing itself out, and we can make comparisons between the French and the American Revolution as it actually took place, not the storybook picture that we present to ourselves when we're teaching it to our kids, but something closer to the horrors of war and revolution. The second thing that I think is really important to think about here is this. Hegel talks about the wisdom of the government. The government is the Regierung. We've encountered this at different points. We saw this back earlier in the spirit section. We've also seen this brought up previously as well. Not always called exactly the same thing. Sometimes it's the Lord of the world. Sometimes it's framed in other ways. But it's the person who has the power, or the apparatus that has the power, the party, the group of people. How is death some sort of wisdom? Well, if you want to get things done and you're going to encounter opposition to those things, you will probably have to kill some people. Now, that may not be the case forever for us human beings, but it certainly is at the points in history that Hegel is thinking about. By the way, a little bit of digression here. If anybody ever tries to tell you that everybody was more or less in agreement, having the same sort of mindset back in ancient times, medieval times, early modern times, all you have to do is read some history or study some Hegel to know that that's bunk. There is no idyllic state for us to return to. It was always conflict over some things. And here, the conflict is over going to be what the universal, or if we want to use Rousseau's terms, general will is actually requiring of us. So Again, how can death be wisdom of the government? Here's where Hegel doesn't say this, but this is actually well worth thinking out. Who does the government impose death upon, especially the kind of death that we're referring to here, where human beings are reduced to mere ciphers and then those are erased from the page? Sometimes it's against what's perceived as an external enemy. The barbarians threatening your civilization. You can go and lay them waste, and you don't need to bother counting them up, except maybe to see what sort of payment the soldiers need to get. Colonization can work like that as well. You impose your rule on an area and then say, all right, the rest of you are now subjects of such and such, and begin to eliminate them in a dehumanizing way, a way that clears them out of there so that you can take their land, their resources, whatever they have built up at the time, which may include all sorts of agricultural products, processes, trading routes, any of those sorts of things. But where a government, once government really starts to get organized and has something like a perceived legitimacy behind it, where a government really has the greatest opportunity to do killing and reduction of people down to nothing is with its own subjects. And this has happened time and time again, and this did happen within the French Revolution. It's kind of a combination of sorts, because some parts of the French Revolution where mass killing was going on, it was much more like colonization, where not everybody in France was behind the revolution, including many of the common people who didn't want those revolutionaries with their Parisian ways telling them what to do. There was a struggle between the center and the provinces, sometimes very bloody. Revolts were put down with great, what would you call it? What we call extreme prejudice sometimes. In any case, the government is particularly able to impose, or at least to threaten, this death of effacement against its own citizens. And that is what happens. So Hegel goes on and he says, the wisdom of the government, the abstract intelligence of the universal will. The government is supposed to be representing the universal will, he says, in the fulfilling of itself. Why is the government in place? Well, because it's supposed to be enacting what the universal will wants. What is the universal will, however? It's some sort of common good, or if we want to get away from the notion of good, it's sort of like an assemblage of all of the wills of the people involved in the commonwealth or the society, whatever it is that we're focusing on. So the government is stepping in and doing something concrete, being real, as we could say. Now, how does this play itself out? Here's where we get into a problematic dialectic. He says, the government itself is nothing else but the self-established, notice, self-established, not just they vote the government in and everybody's like, oh my goodness, what an honor. I'll take this on. No, you campaign to get power, right? There's an element of taking it there. He says the self-established focus or the individuality of the universal will. So here's a key thing. He says the government wills and executes its will from a single point. Now, does he mean always that it's like a despotic ruler? No, it could be a Politburo. It could be a committee, right? It could be an entire bureaucracy. But it has some sort of commonality to it that allows itself to be consolidated within a single point. He says it at the same time wills and executes a specific order and action. Now, I wanted to dwell on this a little bit. Specific. Bestimmte. Why is that specific? It is specific because it's determined. It's determinate. it's one thing to have a universal will. Like we could say, well, what are our general principles? We want everybody to be able to live a life free of interference from other people, when that interference is irrational. Obviously, if I want to burn trash here in the center of Milwaukee, the cops should come along and say, hey, buddy, what are you doing there? I don't think that smoke should be blowing in everybody else's faces. But we have a general principle like that. That's fine. That's a universal will. How do you enact that? How do you make that concrete? It has to be made determinate, and that you need a government to do that. You need somebody who's actually in charge. So a specific ordering, an Anordnung, a way of structuring society, a way of differentiating people, and then action or comportment, Handlung. Right? And the government, the reason I've got more than one arrow here is because the government is doing this continuously. It doesn't just do it once and then everything is fixed and solved and we just move on and get to the stuff that we really want to do. No, the government continuously has to be involved in governance. So he says, on the one hand, what does this do? It excludes all other individuals from its act. So all the others don't get to be on the same plane as the government. This is what it means to be sovereign, right? So he says, on the other hand, it thereby constitutes itself a government that is a specific will, and so stands, here's where it becomes more tragic, opposed to the universal will. So it's supposed to be fulfilling the universal will. And in order to do that, it has to also at the same time resist the universal will. By becoming determinate, by becoming specific the way it has to, it places itself in opposition. Not just to these others who've been excluded, but to the entire universal will. This means that legitimacy is never entire. It's never finished. It's never complete. So he says, what's the result of this? It's impossible for it to exhibit itself as anything else but a faction. And here Hegel actually uses just the term Faktion. This is an idea that's been around for a very long time. The ancient Greeks called this by the term stasis. And this was a central preoccupation for ancient political theory because it happened all the time. Societies would break down into factions. Sometimes we also use the word partisanship for this as well. So they're sharing the same common social space, but they're jockeying and sometimes warring and sometimes killing each other over that. The government becomes a faction. And it becomes, as he says, merely the victorious faction. So why can't the rest of these people get together and say, let's become a faction ourselves. Let's get rid of these bums and put a new set in place. Who won't be bums? They'll be better. There's always that promise that we're going to do something that is going to, in fact, realize the universal will. So if the people are starving, and the government says, well, it's because we haven't had very good harvests and we're trying to negotiate with those monarchist enemies for some grain, you can get impatient with them and say, you know what they're doing? They're hoarding that bread just like those aristocrats did before. Let's revolt against them, get rid of them, and guillotine them. And by the way, put me in charge of that project, won't you? So he goes on and he says, the very fact of the government being a faction, in the very fact of that lies the direct necessity of its overthrow. Oftentimes, people want to portray Hegel's philosophy as if, it's got this thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing. And what's important about thesis and antithesis is that, you've got a thesis, an original thing, and then somehow out of it comes its opposition. In this case, that's actually true. There is an antithesis that's coming out of the, self-same rejecting itself, We might imagine this happens through purges or disagreements within the faction that comprises the government, and then they agitate against them. Now, he goes on and he says, being a government also makes it into a faction and so guilty. Everybody becomes guilty within this society. Nobody's hands are clean after a certain point. So he continues and he says, when the universal will maintains that what the government has actually done is a crime committed against it, how is that going to happen? How does the universal will maintain that the government is engaging in crimes against the universal will? Some of these others have to speak for the universal will. And insofar as the government actually is guilty, has engaged in specific actions that can be viewed in a negative light, there is an opportunity for that new faction to get some power and to represent the universal will. If they succeed, of course, what do you think is going to happen? Well, they become the next government, and this entire thing repeats again. So he goes on and he says, what the universal will maintains is that what the government has actually done is a crime committed against it. The government, for its part, has nothing specific and outwardly apparent by which the guilt of the will opposed to it could be demonstrated. For what stands opposed to it as the actual universal will is only an unreal, pure will, intention. What is he talking about there? Well, the others who speak for the general will, they don't actually have the power. They may have a different kind of power. Maybe they control the press, or maybe they get the people behind them. But for the time being, from the perspective of the government, they're actually traitors. And now we see that death becomes, not just an option, but almost an inevitability for both sides. So he goes on and he talks about suspicion here. Being suspected takes the place or has the significance and effect of being guilty. This is a very important transition. Being suspected takes the place of actually being guilty. What makes you actually guilty? Well, that you've done something or that you can be demonstrated to have done something. What happens in revolutions is that those who are even suspected of having done something are treated as if they are just as guilty of having done it. This runs throughout the entire society. And he says the external reaction against this reality that lies in the simple inwardness of intention consists in cold, matter-of-fact annihilation of this existent being, from which nothing else can be taken away but its mere being. And again, we see the sort of dehumanizing of the opponent. They're not even really an opponent at that point. They've been reduced to something like a mere obstacle that has to be eliminated. And so when we sketch this out, you see there's so much more involved in this paragraph when we think about the implications and the historical reference that Hegel has in mind here. So once again, we see that absolute terror is going to culminate in death. Now, are we going to learn anything from that death? That's the key question for spirit.